There was a point when I thought we were never going to finish. A point when I thought I was going to go nuts. I have never worked so hard at making something difficult look so simple. Those are words from cinematographer Gordon Willis on his work on Woody Allen's 1983 film, Zelig. Seeing Faces at Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer. And each week I invite a guest on to discuss the film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia Moroni, and today we're talking about Zelig. A quick synopsis of the film is a documentary about a man who can look and act like whoever he's around and meets various famous people. The film stars Woody Allen as Leonard Zelig, Mia Farrow as Dr. Eudora Nesbitt Flesher, and Patrick Horgan as the narrator. It's written by Woody Allen, cinematography by Gordon Willis, directed by Woody Allen, edited by Susan E. Morris, and music by Dick Hyman. Today, my guest is José Roldan, and first episode that we did together was The Gleaners and I, which is part of the Agnès Varda series, which I highly recommend you go listen to, learn more about his background in film, because he's got a very, very interesting background. Actually, I got a lot of feedback from people on that, being like, that's such a cool trajectory of career in film. So I highly recommend people go listen to that episode. But Jose, thank you so much for coming back on the show for Gordon Willis.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Forced me to watch some good movies. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. So because you've been on the show, you've already given all your background as a second-time guest. If you could recommend a couple films that you've watched recently that you think I or the listener should watch, what would they be?
Yeah, the first one's controversial. And controversial only because the director is controversial. But I think it was so powerful. I haven't, you watch movies and sometimes you're kind of like at arm's length watching it. You're like, oh, that was a good shot. That was cool. And other ones you totally forget. You're just like into it. For me, Vortex by Gaspar Noé was that second one. It was so, it's not like a violent movie like his other movies. There's no extreme anything. And maybe it's because I'm getting older, but watching it was, I was white knuckling almost. Like if I was holding the DVD, I don't know it was just overwhelming because it was just merciless, I guess is the best way to describe it. And I think there was, everybody has like, family situations where maybe there's a health thing or, and then you fast forward just a little bit, like, I wonder what would happen if, near the end of their lives. And then, you sort of see this here and it's really hard to watch. I don't know if, if you're experiencing it live, whether or not it would be a fun movie to watch, but it is, it's super mature. It's kind of like how Quentin Tarantino, they talk about Jackie Brown and they say how that's like a mature film. I think this would be Gaspar Noé's like mature film, the one that it has a lot of trickery, but it's really supporting the story. I think it's wild. And I think people should see it. I just don't think it's not like a heartwarming movie.
No, I haven't seen it yet. I've heard a lot about it, and I feel like it's probably the one that I could handle in a sense that it would be a lot to watch, but won't upset me due to the way he's creating that story. I only said that because his other stuff, I just cannot. It's just not for me. I'm like, this is actually too abrasive, and I don't know how much he actually respects his audience at all. That's a conversation for another time, but I don't know that he does.
You're talking about Irreversible. I know you're talking about Irreversible, and it's divisive. But even his early ones, and I know that Tarkovsky did this, but like he straight up kills a horse in one of his first short films. And you see it, and it was so shocking. And I don't know if I understand that it's a horse meat factory, so it isn't.
Yeah.
It's not an accident. It's not. I don't think it's CGI or anything, but it is. It is meant to be provocative. And his early ones were for sure provocative and Irreversible. Everybody will always talk about that. I think the other ones have been more formally interesting. But this one, I don't know if you would say this one has a soul again, because if you don't like Gaspar Noé, like this isn't going to do it for you. I don't think it's going to turn you into a fan. But it really is interesting to watch. And how about this? If you ever do a month of Gaspar Noé, like I'll be one of your guests.
Oh yeah.
this may never happen, but if it does, if you run out of filmmakers.
Sometimes I do try and push myself. So I know a few people who do like his work, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to that recommendation will jump on watching it if they haven't seen Vortex yet. So that's a good recommendation.
My other one, I messed up. I thought you just mentioned two movies that I'd seen recently that I have opinions on. Not that I recommend, but I really wanted to like Napoleon. Napoleon by Ridley Scott was one I really, really wanted to like. I knew it was going to be in French, and I knew it was going to be the same sort of thing with Oliver Stone's Alexander. That's like the accents are all over the place. But if you think about back in the day, all the accents would have been all over the place anyway. There's no explaining away some of the some of the choices they made in Napoleon. And even Joaquin, like his performance is so like he makes choices and he commits to them. And like, this is what's happening, right? But it's not like Agnès Varda's Napoleon would look any better. You know, like it looks amazing. It just feels grand. And as I understand it, the longer 4-hour version is better because my experience of this Napoleon, like again, I really wanted to like it, so I was trying to like excuse it, but really all it is, it's like a checklist of things that happens in his life. Like we just sort of go from one thing to the next thing, and that's where I think it falls apart. And it could be helped by a longer movie, but then at the same time, who wants to sit through that again? You know, if you know you've been burned once. But
that's fair. I haven't seen it yet either. I've been hearing mixed things about it. Ridley Scott has an interesting career, especially his later stuff where he's just really pumping them out. But like he's not pumping out like, you know, simple movies either. They're all like very grand. Yeah. I don't know how he has it in him. Like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to respect him.
You do, yeah. He's kind of like an old-time jazz person or like a blues guitar player that's still doing it. You know, I think about all those like Quentin. I was gonna say Kanye. Like Quentin, you know, when he says, you know, I'll only do the 8 or whatever, I'll only do like he just sort of limits himself. You know, Ridley Scott is not about that life. You know, I'm making movies, and you're right, they're not small. You know how Francis Ford Coppola went small for a while. Because he was just like, you know, I don't want to have to get people to agree to pay for the budgets and all that, right? Yeah. And Ridley Scott just goes big. And I think he has hits and misses, but man, like I'd rather him make movies than not make movies, I think.
Exactly. Who knows, like some of these movies 10 or 20 years from now with age, you come back and reappraise them. I find that happens with a lot of movies. Or you're just like, oh, I don't like this at all anymore.
Yeah. Oh, that's the worst.
Yeah.
Isn't that the worst when you
really
love the movie and now it's like dumb when you watch? Like I'm scared to rewatch Fight Club, which was amazing to me, but I don't want to feel like I'm an incel now.
Right. I'm so glad that you said that because it's been a hot minute, like over 10 years since I've seen it. And like we used to watch it a lot in high school, but I don't think I've seen it since then. And I'm like, I don't know if I would like this anymore.
I know.
We'll see.
But then
one day.
Yeah. Not to digress. Please let's get in on this Gordon Willis guy.
We'll get it. Yeah. We're talking about Zelig today, 1983, which is film directed by Woody Allen, but we're talking about it through the lens of Gordon Willis. Do you recall the first time you watched Zelig?
I do. When I used to work at Warner Brothers, they used to have, I was there for the transition from VHS to DVD. And so they were getting rid of all these old VHSs and they were just giving, like, you could buy them as an employee. And I bought so many of those, you know, like nobody wanted all these sort of borderline artsy things. And Zelig was one of them. And at the time, not all his movies were easily to find. And this one in particular was harder to find. And I think what grabbed me the most was, I'm pretty sure the cover was the different font faces. Like they had that sort of iconic Zelig poster where it's like Zelig written over and over, but in different fonts, which is kind of a super clever way to encapsulate the movie on the poster. And when I watched it, I think I dug it right away because you know, it wasn't so long from when I had seen Forrest Gump. I mean, like, you know, relatively speaking. And so I'm like, oh, it's that thing they did in Forrest Gump. These guys did it before.
Yes,
It was a weird movie. Yeah.
It is a weird movie. I have the DVD one and it also still has the different fonts on there, which I love as the cover art. Yeah, I would have watched it probably late teens, early 20s as I was going through Woody Allen's filmography. So it was just one that was just the next on the list to watch. And I don't think I knew anything about it. Was not expecting any of that. Because this opens up as a documentary. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't realize he made a documentary. And I was like, oh, it is, but it's not. I was like, this is insane. I cannot believe that. I don't know that people talk about this movie that much. I mean, especially now, but like if we're going back maybe 10, 15 years, I don't remember hearing too much about it.
No. When people did talk about Woody Allen, he had so many sort of big hits that this one wouldn't have been. I mean, he's got so many. And even if you stop, but this one in particular is kind of a throwback to his first one, the Take the Money and Run, where it didn't really work, the sort of mockumentary thing. And this one, I think not he himself necessarily, but the whole team really pulled it off.
Yeah.
They built this in a way that even now it doesn't feel aged. Like there was only a few shots where I'm like, wow, this is fake. But most of the other ones didn't feel that way, right? And it's cool.
Which I'm sure we'll obviously cover that as well. But before we actually get into the film itself, just wanted to kind of get your opinion on Gordon Willis. When did you start noticing his work, and what really kind of drew you to his style of photography?
In preparing for this, I watched a bunch of Gordon Willis stuff, and I realized it was such a shock that I think he is the definition of the look of a film that I love. I didn't know that at the time, like until you look at his work as a whole, that it was actually him. Like there are other people who carry a style through the way they shoot films. And I'm going to sound like Ken from Barbie, but like The Godfather is, the movies that really opened me up to sort of this, this sort of grandeur. It's like, the iconic 70s movies.
Yeah.
And this one really just spoke to me in so many different ways. The Godfather 2, which they don't mention in Barbie, is my favorite. And so many of these images that stayed with me for a long, long time are Gordon Willis's. And the more you learn about it, you're like, oh, he did this on purpose. Like this wasn't an accident. He super planned all this stuff. And so I have a lot to thank him for, because not even counting some of the ones I discovered in my research, but just the basic iconic ones, right? Like the Godfathers, and let's just leave it at, or, I guess Manhattan, Annie Hall, and those ones like that. This guy created a lot of the stuff that shaped my viewing habits of what I think is cool when I first started getting into cinema, which I found shocking, to be able to encapsulate this, to be able to identify this person.
Yeah, I think that happens when you're watching a film on the first time, unless you're specifically looking at, who shot this, if that's your interest. You're just looking at this is the director's work. It's not usually until a rewatch where you realize, oh, the cinematographer in this, why does this feel familiar? Oh, because he shot all these other movies. I just like the reason why I wanted to do Gordon Willis is because I love 70s American cinema, and he's like the definition, as you said, of that era. It just, when you think of the 70s, there's no way, even if you're not consciously thinking of Gordon Willis, the imagery that you're picturing is his imagery. So, and it's interesting because they were talking about an 80s film of his, but this is the one that he got, accolades for.
Can you believe that? That was a huge shock to me. Like, if you remove all of his work from just like the canon, you'd be left with nothing. Like, not that the 70s didn't have other people, but like he's so impactful in the stuff that he did that it would be really weird to see those, like, the reels of like the highlights of a decade and not see his movies in it. You couldn't have picked a better person. And he's I usually hate on the 80s just in general, even though I was like raised by 80s movies. Like those are the first movies I experienced, like Star Wars and well, not Star Wars, the Empire and these Indiana Jones and all the stuff that like a kid would watch in the 80s. I usually hate on it because it's kind of like this, it wasn't my style. Like when I got into like cinema, it was, it was the French New Wave. It was some silent stuff. It was like super, pretentious-y type stuff. But like even some of the classic studio things, and then obviously the 70s, and then the 90s. But never do I say, oh, the 80s. Like I usually could skip it, but I've learned my lesson. There's a few movies that came out in the 80s that are actually amazing.
I feel like I remember you saying that from the first episode, that the 80s were not your jam. And I was like, yeah, that's me in like the 2000s.
Yeah, I almost stopped counting in the 2000s. Well, no, I think 2004 had some bangers, but
they did.
Yeah, Eternal Sunshine.
Oh, yeah. Okay. See, sometimes you have like one little gem here and there.
That's how I felt about the 80s, totally.
Yeah. See, so I totally understand you. But if you're ready, we can get into Zelig. So I know I keep saying before we get into it, I'm not trying to push the discussion on the film, but we have to mention this film is directed by Woody Allen, and it stars Woody Allen. It's got his voice all over this. And I know that he is I don't know. Controversial seems like such a minimal word for his status right now, but I'm going to use it. Controversial figure because of his personal life and just wanting to address that because I know that can be upsetting for people, but noting that we are talking about a film that's not created by just one person and there's a whole team of people, including the person that we're chatting about today, which is Gordon Willis. I'm assuming anyone who's listening to this has seen the film. There's no actual spoilers if you haven't, so happy to listen to this and be inspired and go watch the film. Highly recommend you watch this film, despite whatever, feelings you have for the director. But this film is mixing real footage along with footage they're shooting, and they're inserting characters, namely Zelig, played by Alan, into footage, like newsreel footages in some older films of the 90s and 20s. I think we touched upon this before we actually started, but the first time I watched this, I remember feeling a little confused. I was like, is this like actual footage or did they film it and they're pretending like it's actual footage? How did they manage to get it to look this way and insert him into that? So how was your thoughts when you first saw how they were able to put him into those scenes?
I would think I was prepared conceptually because I had what you just described with one of my favorite movies, but I saw it in university, which was Land Without Bread, or Las Urdes. It's a movie by Luis Buñuel, and it was in 1933. And it's a total mockumentary, and it's narrator driven. And I had exactly what you were saying. Like, is this, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Is this supposed to be funny? Because I feel like this is supposed to be funny, but it's kind of mean if I laugh, especially if those are real people. The ethics in 1933, when Louis Buñuel was doing that stuff, were just totally out the window. Like I think he killed like a bunch of goats. There's actually an animated film about the making of that movie, which is also wild. It's an alternate universe where they make animated films about Luis Buñuel. And that experience prepared me for Zelig because it's just sort of a studio version of that, with the added sort of postmodern collaging that you discussed. So there are no famous people in that Luis Buñuel movie, but it's the fact of like the tone is throwing me off. Like, is this real? Is this a joke? Is this real? You just sort of keep going back every shot, and it's like a meta viewing experience, even if it's your first time, I think. And I think Zelig kind of would have the same experience today if somebody were to watch it, especially if they don't know who the director's work. Like, that would be an interesting experiment to have somebody watch it without knowing anything else, and just see what their opinion is.
I think there's so much time that's passed, and I don't know. I mean, I'm not one to shit on, Gen Z. Like, I think they're great. I don't know how many of them are actively seeking out Woody Allen films. So if one of them were to come across just thinking this is a documentary, not knowing who that is at all, I'd be interested to see their reaction on this, because we're watching it knowing this is Woody Allen, right? So we have that.
It's almost the most Woody Allen. Like, this movie is almost designed to just have him do his, not stand-up routine, but his like one-liners that really have no place in any other narrative. But in this one, he was able to sneak in so much. But I don't know. I don't think any Gen Zs will stumble upon it. I think it'll be more of a Gen Alpha type thing. Like the next generation will be in a position to just like, what's this weird? I don't know how they would find it, frankly. But if they did, they'd be so far removed from, all the events. That,
beyond. One of the ways they were able to achieve the look, they use a lot of actual lenses and camera and sound equipment from the 20s. So they did that, but then they went in and like really studied the same lighting techniques that they would have done in those specific scenes that they're taking. So that's different. There's quite a bit of different lighting that has to go on throughout this film because there's so many different footages that they're using. But when they got the negatives, Gordon Willis brought them in the shower and stomped on them. Which I thought was so interesting, because I was like, how do you get that? Because this is an age where, digital wasn't a thing. So they weren't shooting this and changing it digitally. So they had to use the actual film to do it. So that's interesting. But I remember this thinking, how is he able to match the lighting? Like, I know this man's talented, but it doesn't seem like there should be, in other hands, you would see that distinct, like, when we cut to Zelig,
oh, the lighting looks different. Like it's not even like they're in the same room. How did you feel about them being able to match the lighting and just make it seem so seamless throughout?
The lighting, it wasn't just the lighting, it was the softness of the image and the grain, of the stock they used, and a lot of the sort of under cranking, like people were kind of running a little bit when they shouldn't have been, and there's a bunch of dropped frames in places. It just, like, all the tricks, they used every trick to sort of hide it, along with using the actual equipment, which I think the sound does the most to really bring it home. I think it ties it all together for a movie that doesn't require continuity like in the same way that a regular movie does. You do kind of need to match the sort of archival. There was a scene where there was like the Ziegfeld girls were like serenading the main characters of this movie. So it's like on the camera turns to the right and it's all these newsreel people, and then you cut to the left and it's our actors, and it doesn't look any different. And that's really masterful. Like now, I guess too, people wouldn't understand just how difficult it would have been to age film, because it would just be a filter or whatever now, like your phone does it. But as I understand it, it was more of they did use the old equipment, but the real magic was in the lab. It was like a nightmare for the lab that they used. Yes. And so that lab actually got people out of retirement to work on this film. And I was like, okay, well, maybe they're the ones with the tricks, right? Like they would have known what not to do. And they're like, just, go put it in water, call back, if it doesn't look good or something. But what a fascinating undertaking, I think, to be so authentic to the time period, just because that's how the gag worked. Otherwise it wouldn't work without all that extra stuff that they added to it.
No, it wouldn't. And like originally the film was like 45 minutes long because it's all like they could do, but then he was like, I gotta stretch this out so that it's a feature length film. So that's where you get a lot of like the voiceover stuff, and more of Mia Farrow's character doing her stuff, because that doesn't require being inserted into other footage as much. But it's also just like the power of Alan and Willis, and to be able to get people out of retirement to do this, because some no-name director, they'd be like, that seems like too much. You're doing too much right now. Like we need to dial it back. This is a huge undertaking. And like I think the film was filmed like 2 years before it was released, and there was 2 other films that Woody Allen shot. And so even with Willis, was released before Zelig was. Willis was saying that it was a pain to do and took way more out of me than I anticipated, but he doesn't regret, that final product. And how could you, right? There's not many people who can say that they created this.
It was such a successful result. Like you get the impression, sometimes you watch movies and you're like, the end result definitely is not what they started off thinking it was going to be. And then you might learn about movies. Like Annie Hall famously was horrible until the editing. Like they just couldn't make it work. And then it was sort of fixed in the editing. With this one, you obviously couldn't do that. Like the whole thing, it's almost like they set out to conquer, to climb this hill, and they did it, So in that way, it's really interesting in the sort of filmography. But didn't you find it so random that this was his first nod at the Academy Awards? Because I was like, what did he even do here? Like you almost have to go like, was that could have been the editor? That was a lot of the the makeup. There's the special effects people. Like, was it actually him? And then, after watching a bunch of interviews, I'm like, no, he was totally involved. So sure, let's give him the nod. But like, wasn't that weird that this is the first one that people are like, you know what? Let's give him a nomination.
It really is, because as much as I love the look of this film, it is, like you said, there's so many other factors in here that make it special. Whereas opposed to other films that he shot, like I've covered Clute and All the President's Men. Those are all great films, but you're remembering the visuals in this film. Like those films don't work as well without his, vision behind it. Whereas, not to diminish his work on this, I think that he's very much, a stamp on this, but I think it is, like you said, it's weird that this is the first. But then with the Academy, we all know that they just never get it right. Even like the last cinematographer I covered was Robbie Mueller, and he was never nominated for a single movie.
It's almost like I'm sure, I don't know if it feels this way while you're trying to get, work, but it must be like a badge of honor. Like the amount of people who haven't gotten an Oscar that only got the one at the end, the sort of lifetime achievement one. That it's probably a better, filmography than if you did all the best pictures, of the Oscars. I think he seems to me to be very involved. And there are some shots where you're like, oh, this is super Gordon Willis. Like, do you remember when Mia Farrow's character is struggling with the way the treatment is going? She sort of be smoking in her study. In those shots were just super beautiful, like straight out of Clute, one single source light in the back that's sort of like there's like a rim light happening on the edge of her hair, and like the smoke is lit in like this most the most 1940s noir type thing, and it looks so beautiful. And then I'm like, oh, that's where he is. He's here.
I agree. I think most of my favorite shots in this film are with the Mia Farrow character, because it kind of gives you a relief, from the overload of Zelig's doing this and that. And it is funny, but sometimes it's like, okay, I just need to, be given a second, because there's a lot of different transformations. So she's like, the most calming presence in the film. And he does, she gets a lot of great shots.
What did you think of the sort of Ken Burns? Because I imagine this is another role that Willis would have played significantly in, is when he, the camera will just take a still image and then like zoom in, and sort of, it'll be two still images sort of like, but there's multiple shots because he's like zooming into one of the characters in the photo, and then it cuts to another. And what did you think of that kind of staging, blocking, that he did?
I noticed it a lot on this watch. I don't know that I remembered that happening, but I noticed it a lot. And I was like, I just found it kind of funny. I liked it. And I only say funny because like so many people have done it since, but they don't do it anymore. Like, I think it stopped in like the 90s. You get like a lot of those cheesy zoom ins. I don't think it's cheesy here, but it definitely translated in later on in the 80s and the 90s as being very cheesy. I think it works here because I don't even know. I just think it adds another layer of realism to the documentary that's happening, because it is a documentary within the film, and it kind of sometimes makes you forget that this is actually not a documentary. Like those scenes always, I'm like, oh yeah.
And like, is it a parody? Were you like, is this a parody of Ken Burns? Because I guess Ken Burns was around there, but I didn't get that vibe. Like, I was like wondering, is he like, are they making some sort of reference to the documentary sort of like tropes? But it was so early in Ken Burns' career that he didn't become, he wasn't the Apple iPhoto effect until way later. I got La Jetée vibes actually from those. Do you see that? Yeah. Like the sort of narrator driven pictures. Yeah,
I could definitely see that. And I think that's what, with the narration, that happens, because I know that originally that wasn't supposed to play such a big part. So they added that on. I can see him being inspired by La Jetée. Like, I don't think, as you said, it was a parody of anyone. I think it's probably just inspired by, and him being like, okay, this is like silly, but there has to be serious moments here.
I do think that there was a parody aspect to the talking head interviews, which is kind of because it was only a couple of years after Reds, and Reds has famously those like old people talking about back in the day. So it was kind of like that. You'll have like Susan Sontag and like Saul Bellow and everybody talking in this movie, and that felt a lot like, oh, you're making a reference. Yeah, and they're being funny. Actually,
because they're so serious. Like, it doesn't seem like they are acting. It just seems like they're talking about their time as Zelig, and I was like, wow, those are pretty good performances from them. I even love I think the coloring and the lighting in those scenes, because that's when we flash to color. It's just great. Then I got the flash of like Gordon Willis again. You're like, okay, now we're getting some more Willis in here. But it's just an interesting film to talk about in terms of cinematography, because there's so much of that mixing and of the other footage, and figuring out what it is that he was able to do, and like how much time did he spend shooting those scenes, because the inserting of stuff, a lot of this was had to have done in the editing, as you said. But I just think it is an important film to to talk about, especially because this is the only one of his that I've covered that's in black and white for this series. So I think that's also important to see the duality of, because I always think of color and with Gordon Willis.
Yeah.
But then he's shot some really big films in black and white, like Manhattan, like this.
You know, he hated color. He called it a nuisance to have to deal with color, which is so,
I'm sure it
so
is.
interesting. Yeah, because he's like, you can't just come in dressed however you want. You know, he was like, black and white is totally different, and he you can tell that he loved it. He just loves this control that he has in black and white. While this one was crazy in other ways, at least it was, you know, he was able to make it, you know, the costumes weren't necessarily part of the problem in this case to make it mad. He's a funny guy. I like how grumpy he is.
Same. But like, I think he's merited it. But like, you did say something interesting about, you know, the black and white, because the black and white here is different from the black and white in Manhattan, because the black and white here is mirroring 20s and 30s, which is not the same as Manhattan's the 70s. So that's different. So they're completely different black and white films, but it's still color grading. And it's just the attention to detail that really makes it work, because I think that's where he's so important as it comes to the film, because I think if they didn't get the coloring, the lighting down, you would have been so taken up. You just really wouldn't take it seriously at all. You'd be like, it's supposed to be stupid. And you'd be like, yeah, I don't know that we'd be talking about it.
Yeah, because it's more than just the scratches. Like, it isn't just the old look. It's the way that the lighting, it's like, you know, the way the shadows are visible in a way that they would have been visible if it was newsreel footage, or they wouldn't have had like, there's a scene where they bring out Zelig from a hallway and they go up the stairs in the courtroom, and like, it's all dark, like, it's just, you can't even see anything. You know it's him because of his silhouette, which is again a super Gordon Willis thing. And then there's only one light. They enter this pool of light and then they leave to go up the stairs, and that's it. And then there's no way so many directors of photography would have let that happen, right? It's you know, actually Gordon Willis has this thing where like he sort of dismisses Hollywood. I think he's more of a New York filmmaker, and he's like, in Hollywood they should walk around with a shirt that just says fear, because they're just cowards. Like, you know, they don't like committing to, you know, like, he gets into arguments with directors about, you know, directors saying, okay, what are my options? Like, you don't have any options. You have to get an idea and you commit to it, you know. And then that's the kind of guy you get to do this kind of stuff, because he'll be like, no, they wouldn't have had that light back then. They would have, you know, done it this way, and we can still find something inciting in it. But yeah, it's that's the kind of guy you hire for this, I think.
And I don't know that he got along with most of his directors that he worked with, because I was reading an article on Cinephilia and Beyond, which I'll include in the sources, because they have some really great stuff about Gordon Willis's career that I've been kind of relying on for the series. And one of the interviews where they're talking about all the ones that he's worked with a lot, like Woody Allen, Pakula, and, you know, Coppola, and he's just like ripping on all of them.
Yeah.
He's like, Allen was just such a pain to work with, and he talked about Hal Ashby, and he's like, he's a great guy, but he just high the whole time, and that annoyed me. And he's like, yeah, but I'm still here. We're gonna do our job. You know, I don't have to like you, and I like that.
That's amazing. That's
very working man's D.O.P.
Totally. Yeah, he talked about how he was always afraid of not having a job. And, you know, the person interviewing him was like, that's wild, you're Gordon Willis. And it was more about him, you know, just not working class. Like, his family was in the business. So he knew about the entertainment business, but to him, it was kind of an industry kind of thing. So he, you know, I think he worked a lot in commercials, where I think he mentioned he learned a lot of the technique, you know, not the story stuff, but the technique stuff he really sort of honed in commercials. But when he talks about the directors, he was saying how he was kind of dissing Coppola, because he's like, I work in, he said something like, I have it in my notes somewhere, where he's like, I work in specific, like, don't give me the emotion stuff. I don't want like how you're feeling about this. Tell me, like, we got to talk about what this scene is about, you know, how many cuts we need. And I found that kind of refreshing, you know, because I think of Coppola the way you would think of Coppola, as this massive person, you know, in history, like in this historical moment, right? To him, it was just his coworker, and he was like, no, you know. And there's another thing he said. He says, like, I rarely let a director get off track. So you're not shooting 7 movies; you're shooting the one that we committed to at the beginning. You know, like that kind of thing. It's like, I love that.
Sometimes
he's
you need someone who's going to put you in your place and be like, listen, I need to finish this job so I can get another job after this. I have a family to feed. And then they kept hiring him.
Yeah. I mean, eventually it became one of those sort of like, Greg Toland things. Like he just puts not the Oscar on the table, but it's like, here are the movies I made. If you want me, I'll be over here. Like, would you say though that when you think of all the Alan movies that you've seen, that there's a moment when you know that Gordon Willis entered the chat? Like, can you tell in his filmography, you're like, oh, they look different now, or they're more sophisticated? Or would you say the Alan style maintained its way all the way through?
No, it definitely didn't. And as someone who's seen literally every Woody Allen film, Annie Hall is the first one they shot together. But I think it might have been. I always just think of interiors specifically.
Oh, yeah.
As being the one that was so different. And it's noted as being that very different because it's that very European-esque look of it. It's very Bergman. And I remember thinking for a long time, because I was watching a lot of Bergman at the same time when I would have first watched that, thinking it was Sven who had shot it and not realizing it was Gordon Willis. And I was like, oh, okay. So see, they were obviously inspired by a lot of Sven's work, but you could see that Gordon was very capable. And I think that's the shift, because then you get stuff like Zelig, then you get Stardust Memories, which is also such a beautiful black and white film with him. I think Annie Hall, when you go back and look at it, you're like, okay, this is very much Gordon Willis. But I don't know that it would have been different then. Annie
Hall to me is like this unlit movie. I don't think of any shots as like particularly beautiful or designed. And then you look at it and you're like, and he explains, there's this shot that I liked from Annie Hall when the one guy's trying to convince him to call him that his name should be Mac, like, and then like Tony Roberts is then they're walking and you don't know who's talking. It's like this movie, this unmoving frame. And then you notice, oh, in the back, there's two guys talking, and eventually they walk up to the camera. And that's that's not a fancy lighting thing, but that's 100% a cinematographer move, right? Like that. It's like, we don't need to move the camera. This is what the shot needs. It's actually kind of funny, and so.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's something I've noticed a lot. Not so much in this film, but in the other films I've covered, where he likes to sometimes just be like, the camera doesn't need to be moving right now. Allow the actors to move in and out of frame as we need to see them. And that's a choice. Yeah. So I love that.
But I do think, I didn't see it in Annie Hall. I suppose I saw it in Manhattan, but like was Interiors before Manhattan?
Yeah, they were right.
So it would have been Interiors as well. Yeah. Yeah. So Interiors would have been the big sort of glow up on the looks. And now that if you see all the Gordon Willis stuff side by side, it's very clear that it's him. Right, like the I did a bit of fashion photography like many years ago, and I loved the sort of like really dark stuff. That to me was, it's so much. It's almost like you're suggesting what's there more than showing what's there, and I think that's what he does so well. Like, so I'm sure I was just influenced by him, but the way that if you think about traditional Hollywood and what the studio system required movies to be, which were like star vehicles. They need to look this way. They have a brand. They have to see the eyes. You know how some of the old classic movie actresses would work with only one cinematographer like their whole life, because it's like they knew how to light them. I don't know if it was, I guess it was Marlene Dietrich or somebody. And, that his style of shooting would not work for that era of filmmaking.
No.
What do you mean I can't see her face? Like, why does she not look beautiful at all times? Right. Because that wasn't the purpose, right? His purpose was for the story, and their purpose was, I'm trying to sell this, this legend, this larger than life figure as this most beautiful woman on earth, No,
that's very valid. I don't know that he would have. I think he was around at the time that he was meant to be. And yeah. I miss films looking, not that we were alive, at that time in the early 70s, but I miss, just seeing stuff like that. That's why I always gravitate towards stuff from the 70s, especially American films. Because I do want to talk about parts of the story that we've talked about the story, but just how it translates to audiences today watching it. But before that, are there any of the parts of the cinematography that we haven't covered that you want to chat about?
Yeah, the cinematography of the film, I think, was really opinionated, right? Like, it just strikes me like what we've been saying, that it was meant to be authentic. He does these things too, where I think it was in those zoom-ins that we were talking about. Oh yeah, those still images really still communicate all the information between the Mia Farrow character and the Zelig character when they're doing the treatments and sort of the psychological analysis. The shots that you get in Zelig, even though they're just photos, are still done in such a way that you get all the information that you would have gotten anyway if it was an actual film. And so to be able to pull that off just really shows you where, like somebody like a Gordon Willis could really make that happen. It wasn't just a random picture they took. It was still as framed and as blocked as it would be if it was a moving camera. And it's just kind of what we were saying, that he doesn't necessarily need all the lights. He might need no lights, right? He might need just the window, or he might need an unmoving camera, or in this case, a photo. But in all those cases, he adjusted it so it communicated the information that we needed to get. And I think that's where, I don't know, it's pretty easy to call him a master, but like I think that's where you get that master vibe, in those kinds of details.
I agree. I hadn't even thought about it, about, the still photography of him not treating it like it's a still, but I definitely see that. That's so interesting. I mean, what else can we say? Like, the man will be hopefully forever remembered for his work. I hope we don't forget him.
He retired too.
Yeah, he did. I guess one of the last things about Zelig is, if we're talking about story-wise, there's a lot going on in this film, as we've said, but one of the things is that because this character is transforming into different people, we're getting a lot of this actor in, blackface, brown face, and whatever different color face. And it's a lot, and it's a lot to watch. I don't know what it would have been like in the 80s. I assume a lot of people would have been like, this is pushing it, but it calls for it in the story. Can we excuse it? How do you feel about it? I know that there's no way audiences today would accept this and immediately be banned. Yeah,
he'd be almost where he is now, even if he just did that.
Yeah.
But it's really hard not to laugh at it. Like, it's tough, like it just seems so ridiculous that if this movie came out now, like you can't imagine what, or you can imagine, like it would just be so obviously destroyed in every way, right? That he not only, I think he's not just blackface, like he turns into an Asian guy and a Native American person, and to like it's just like and I know he's Jewish, but there's all the Jewish like stereotypes too. Like he just gets everywhere, and it works for the movie in as much as, like, how different would it be, I guess, if that wasn't there? And I think it would sort of, like, the whole movie resolves itself by him doing one final transformation where the skills of the person he's copying save the day when he's sort of taking them upon himself. So that extreme, like, that's the conceit of the movie. So if he does that, then somewhere along the way, he's taking the faces too and the body shapes. And it's, I don't know that anybody in the 80s would have noticed, frankly. I think it was, I don't know. I think it was excused at the time for sure, is my guess. But
yeah, that's my guess too. Yeah, I might be giving audiences of the 80s a little bit too much credit, but it's just so it's difficult not to have those things in the movie, because it just, at that point, it's just like, well, just don't make it, maybe. Well,
no, exactly, right. And that reasoning I just gave, like, oh, because it works for the movie, then I guess it sort of leaves room for that, is just like the minstrel shows. Like, I just basically, that could still be used, and those were awful then, like I just don't know. I don't know how to come to terms with that. And it's unfortunate because that, more than anything, that one's the one that you're like, oh, that one's just gonna, like, immediately a problem. Like, there's no and it happens. Did you notice it happens sort of a number of times? And you're like, I get it. He's transforming faces. Like, why do we? Oh, here we go again. Who are we offending now?
Yeah. It was like he just touched every base. He's like, I'm not going to leave anyone unoffended.
Yeah. And this movie has Hitler in it, and like that's not the offensive part. You know what I mean? That's that's one of the funny parts. I don't know that it's good or bad. Watching these movies, like I don't know how I feel about. It's kind of the whole, all these characters that when we first encountered them, we didn't know anything about their personal lives, or we maybe weren't as sophisticated in like what's appropriate. But the more you learn those things, it's just so hard to watch these works of art, because unlike a painting where you can just sort of look away, this is like it's like a multiple images that, then there's a story, and then there's that whole thing where you identify with somebody in the movie. Maybe it's the main character, or maybe it's the secondary, but either way, you're like, it's so much more interactive than if you're watching, if you're just looking at a painting that upsets you, you just kind of look away. Not that doesn't translate, the proper painting will do that for you, but films is such a, and it's because you're in a theater, like originally, you're like hearing other people laugh when the blackface comes on. So you're thinking, oh, this is funny, so that's also problematic. I may just have convinced myself to sort of put this one away and never look at it again. But
yeah, it was a different watch for me too with time. Yeah, I think mirroring everything you just said is exactly how I felt with it too. It's still a great achievement, but yeah.
That's the thing though, right? Like Gordon Willis, and like, I don't know what his politics or his beliefs are. Like, who knows what all these other like all the people who worked on this, the people who came out of retirement, I'm appreciating their work. But it's hard to ignore the fact that this is all under Woody Allen's sort of umbrella. And so it's, it goes all together. But what do you think about this? What's your stance? I mean, this is kind of, have you felt this way about any other films that you've done in the series so far?
No, not yet. And it's interesting, both of us talking about it, because neither of us are white people. And
right.
So it's interesting viewing it from that. And it's like, I've seen this film quite a few times, but I think it just, as life goes on, you grow with films, you grow apart from films. It definitely was like a huge, cringe watching a lot of those scenes, and you kind of just hoping, can this end? How many more times are there? And not that it didn't affect me the first few times I would have watched it, but it definitely did this time, where I was like, it happens maybe one too many times where you're like, okay, I do get it. Let's move on, because that's not even the most interesting stuff about the film. So it's tricky. It's tricky getting. I do think it's a film that people should watch, because I think even something like a lot of older films are racist, problematic, but they're important to watch because that's part of history and how you grow from things. So I'd recommend people watching it for that, but just noting, like, I wouldn't let anyone go in blind, right? I feel there's going to be some stuff that's going to be offensive. So just prep yourself for that. So I think that's how I view it.
I think so much of film history is that. Like, now that because our eldest is 14, and he, he's like got this amazing luck of having like a super cinephile household. And so he gets to watch all the good movies. But we make sure we tell him, like, we're not going to just show you anything. We're going to show it to you at the right time. It's like a DJ dropping the right song at the right time. Because if you watch some movies and you're too young, like I may have seen some movies too young, I didn't get it. And the next time you're like, oh my God, this is amazing, right? You have to like sort of match up, sync it up. And I think there's so many movies now where I have to be like, hey, okay, so this is going to be super misogynist and we don't believe in that. Like how many Hitchcock movies do you have to, like, if you actually had to, you have to, like, here's a disclaimer. He doesn't actually like this leading actress very much, or whatever. And it's a bummer, because like I never had this disclaimer experience, right? Like I would just watch a movie and I'm like, cool, interesting, whatever. And then you grow, and now I feel like even with To Kill a Mockingbird, I had to be like, all right, there will be language in this book that you are going to find objectionable, and here's why it was used, and and we can have a conversation about it. But it isn't as easy as just like, let's just throw this on the TV, or let's just watch this, or just read this book together without acknowledging that this is super not part of our lives.
I think it's good to give a bit of disclaimer without censoring the stuff. I know there's that whole conversation of films getting scenes cut out, and it's like, but why? Like, you can give a disclaimer at the top and leave the film as it is, because that scene is important for this. You're maybe not supposed to like this character, and you taking it out is diminishing how you're supposed to feel about it. So you can't really edit those things out of this movie either, because it's important to know that, hey, that's something that people could get away with back then, which is not even that long ago. It is. It's 40 years, but it's still not that long ago. So
Oh my God. Is it 40? Oh yeah, it is 40 years. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they thought it was funny. Like, for sure, this was thrown in as the joke. Like, it's not even meant to be like, it's not like Bamboozled or something where it's using it as sort of an like to explain what's going on. Like, no, it's not that. There's no statement. It's just, this is funny. And, I'm going to be racist to all these people because it's funny. Like, is there any more that you would want me to, like, and then there's the whole comedy, like, does comedy play the same rules that other culture does? And this is not for this podcast probably, but that conversation continues for this because comedies are supposed to be, comedies make you laugh for, like, if you have a laughing reaction, you feel complicit in what you just laughed at, even though it could have been they totally maneuvered you into that joke or whatever. But you feel like, oh no, I'm to shame a little bit because I laughed a bit at that, right? And I think particular, like designed as a film, it is really the filmmakers that are guiding you towards this laugh. And so it is interesting to show this to people because it's kind of a manipulation thing. It's kind of this is what people used to think. Normal was totally different before. And like, how can I explain it to you? Well, this was supposed to be funny. Like, let's enjoy it now and see if you can enjoy it at all, right? And you can see how different you are now, and for the better, because that's like, it's insane to think that was funny. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think censorship's the right way. I just think that you definitely need so many disclaimers now that some movies are probably not worth the disclaimer, that you have to give. Anyway, bummer for Gordon Willis fans.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but still, as we've been saying, great work on the film. But that was Zelig. I still have a couple more questions for you, which is the last segment of the show. And it will relate now to Gordon Willis's work and then the film itself. But same two questions I asked you last time. So if we're talking about Gordon Willis's body of work and someone's getting into cinematography, they hear about Gordon Willis, let's just say they haven't seen any film he's directed or worked on. That's including like a huge film like Godfather. They haven't seen anything. Where would you recommend they start to get that Gordon Willis feel? And what's the reasoning behind that recommendation?
I think it would be The Godfathers. I think they're really accessible. And I think they play well. You don't need to know about the politics that were going on around the parallax view times. You don't need to know about you don't have to get into the whole Woody Allen thing. You can skip that. Like, you can the Godfather 1 and even more so the Godfather 2 because it jumps in back and forth. It just kind of a lot of the things we talked about. And even though it's got this sort of yellow tint throughout the whole movie, he's explained how in the sort of older period scenes of The Godfather 2, when Robert De Niro is a kid, and the way it was shot was softer, like it looks older. It still has a sort of same yellow tint that the whole movie does, but when you get to the 70s part, or I guess it's the 40s part, then the more modern parts, it's like sharper the way they shot it. And there's so many super dark scenes that are just like paintings, but then there are really bright scenes that are just like paintings. And this whole thing about like every frame's a painting. Like, I think The Godfather 2, which is, I know, is very Ken Barbie for me to say, but the amount of variety of shots that he gets into The Godfather 2 are fantastic and pretty easy to see that that's amazing. And then once you learn that it was a chemical process, like what he was looking at on set looked nothing, and he was not able to tell what it was going to look like. Like, he was able to calculate what it was going to look like, but he wasn't ever seeing it until after, when the dailies came, right? Like, that level of control over how some of these shots were underexposed. And like, once you get into all that, you can still use The Godfather 2 as an example. It's sort of a vehicle to show somebody like, look, this is not just an accident. This is the most calculated, dance with light that you can probably imagine, which in the modern filmmakers, like, like, don't even talk to me with the monitors and the all the stuff that happens now. Like, it's just so much easier than what they had back then.
You actually had to have, not to diss anyone new, but you had to have a level of talent to be like, I know we got this, or look at it and be like, I know exactly what we need to do next time to get it right, as opposed to being like, well, I can fix this on the spot, that's also cool to be able to fix it on the spot, but it just adds that, man, like, I wish I had an ounce of Gordon Willis talent, right?
Like, he says he sort of disses shotgun directing, or no, he calls it I think it's shotgun directing, dump truck directing and shotgun shooting.
Okay.
He means basically directors who will take a shot of everything just to be able to put it together and edit in any number of ways to figure it out. He's totally against that, right? He's like, I need to know, you need to know what you're doing in advance, and we'll get that. Which means that none of those films that we talked about, there wasn't like a C camera. taking a whole different shot of that Godfather 2 scene, right? Like it was only the main camera that was covering it, or not that many. So it wasn't like there was a backup. Like this was the idea. So if you messed up the lighting on the one and it was too dark, then like you'd have to go back and shoot it again. But so I don't know how many times that happened on the Godfather 2, but I think that one carries. So that's like, I think my favorite of his sort of magnum opus. That's his magnum opus, I think.
That's what I've been giving the same overall the episodes, but I've been giving The Godfather because I think you got to watch that for various reasons, but like that perfectly is like a snapshot of what he's able to do in color. And then for black and white, you can watch them like a Manhattan to see what he's able to do there, because they're very different. But also you should just watch those movies too.
Yeah.
We'd recommend those. The second question is the double bill. So this is more related to Zelig, but you can relate it to cinematography as well. That if you're creating a double bill with Zelig, what film would you pair it with? And what's the thematic reasoning behind the pairing?
Yeah, automatically I think of Land Without Bread and this one. Because like you could pick something like, I don't know, you couldn't pick anything serious. You couldn't pick a real documentary that's something like I think Night in Fog, that's like a real deal, one of the most important films ever, and the way it's done is so like sophisticated. But you couldn't like, even though that there is sophistication in Zelig, just thematically it sort of drops the ball. So it wouldn't be a really good twofer, So I would think something like Land Without Bread if you wanted to go down the mockumentary route. But if you want to do a Gordon Willis to show his range, it'd be cool to show that. Zelig, and then follow it up with, I don't know, All the President's Men or something. You're like, this guy did both of these, or pick something that's super contrasty, right? Where you see him, there's a color aspect that he's a master of, and also this black and white archival thing that nobody was doing, until later with digital technology. So he's got he seems like such a control, like he's a master of his craft. Right, in the way that some people are like, wow, they just winged that and they caught it on film. His was more like, I planned this whole thing to happen exactly this way,
Which is great. Not many people can say that. Yeah, the Buñuel film, I'm gonna add that to my list because I haven't seen it yet, and I've been trying to go through most of his filmography. Like I've seen all the greatest hit and so on, but like the earlier stuff, I haven't gotten around to. So that sounds interesting. Definitely gonna try and find that. A copy of that one, so
definitely check it out, and check out the animated sort of behind the scenes of it. It was weird. It's like a graphic novel that turned into animate. Like it's one is on YouTube for sure because it has no rights to speak of. I think Land Without Bread is the easiest to find, and the other one's like a canopy kind of pick. And Luis Buñuel, he's so amazing because his career spanned so much, and he got better with age. Right, where not everybody does. And I think his last movies were so overwhelmingly like fantastic, and so he's definitely one to like, as far as I know, he kicks ass. Like he might have had poor ethics in the 1930s, but like all in, like I think he's one of my faves for sure.
I've liked basically everything I've watched, so I would be interested to go back and watch earlier stuff like that. So those are both great recommendations, and I agree you can't really go with anything serious with this film. So the two that I brought up are very much not serious. One of them is maybe a little bit more, but it's still a comedy. The first one is very unserious, and I recently watched it for the first time, and it's Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
Oh, I've never seen it. Yeah.
It had been on my list for so long, and I recently watched it, and it's exactly Zelig. They were 100% inspired by Zelig, and they're taking all the 1930s, 40s noir films, and they're inserting Steve Martin in it. And it's done actually quite well too, but it definitely takes you out of it more because you're dealing with stars, and you're like, oh, I know that movie, and that's the point. Whereas Zelig is like, these are historical things that you're not everyone's seen those scenes. That would be a funny double bill. And then another one was another Gordon Willis and Allen one that they kind of within the film itself, the story they're mixing of two different mediums, and that was Purple Rose of Cairo. In that film, it's done within the story as opposed to it being the whole story. I thought that would just be interesting to see another Gordon Willis in color, and it's a period piece, but then there's also the mixing of the actors in a film coming out. It's an interesting film that I think that it's another one where I think it was their very last film that they did together. And I think it really bookends, their work. And some might say one of Alan's last best films. He did a lot of great ones after, but it's up for debate for a lot of people. I think that would be two lighthearted films.
No, but totally appropriate. Yeah, like super good. Like in the way that the double bill is a conversation between two totally separate works of art. Like those two are perfect examples, right? You get more out of both by watching them together than you don't. Like knowing that the same two principal sort of people worked on Purple Rose of Cairo and Zelig. Like this was interesting, and they weren't that far away in years, right? It was only like 5 years or something apart.
Yeah, I think it was max. I think it was like 88. I think it's Purple Rose of Cairo, and this is 83. So it's actually 85. So it's only a couple of years.
Wild.
Yeah, but
what an output.
They seem like completely different times in cinema. But yeah, those would be my recommendations, and that was Zelig. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this film, because I think it takes a lot of confidence to come on, talk about a Woody Allen film, directed film, like an adult. Takes a lot of maturity and a lot of confidence to bring it forth, because I think it's an important film, and it's an important film to look at through the lens of Gordon Willis. So I appreciate you bringing it forth for this month.
No, thank you. I was going to say the same thing to you. It's super brave, because it isn't, I think for those of us who've seen and sort of grown up on the Woody Allen movies as like cinephiles, cineasts or whatever, like we know exactly what he means to us, like sort of from that side, from like a discovery of the art form side. Like we know how big a deal he is. So like for those of us who have stopped watching his films, like it's almost more than somebody who was never into Woody Allen and like sort of canceling Woody Allen. Like when I cancel Woody Allen, like it's I do it knowing that like I'm not watching a bunch of movies that I'd be watching regularly, and it's tough. And people have this with musicians that they like, and other sort of filmmakers and stuff. But that's definitely one of the ones that, like there was a time when I would be like, oh, we should watch this Woody Allen. I'm like, you never hear me say that now, like it just won't happen. Right. And that's, that's the deal. So, but I do think it's brave. I don't think that these things just never existed suddenly, right? Like they are here. And if we aren't the ones who are going to sort of explain it to perhaps somebody who's never seen it, then they're never going to hear sort of the nuanced, I don't know, explanations or context that we can provide, as people who like know the filmography really well, but also don't agree with like how things have gone down, right? So anyway, I really appreciate that sort of Gordon Willis focus. It wasn't until I looked at all this work together that I realized, wow, this one person may have been behind the images that I think of. Like if I close my eyes, like one of your favorite, images in cinema, it's like, oh, it was him, and this is why now I sort of see it. It's cool. I love the series that you do. I think it's
great.
Thank
you. Well, I hope you come back again, because you're always very insightful. So I'm sure we'll find another great film.
Oh my God. Just say when. But I can't wait to hear the rest of the episode. Thank you so much for having me on.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia Maroni, with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com, or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And thanks for joining us for our Gordon Willis run.